What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook, and welcome back to another Crafted Workshop video, and welcome to part number 1 of my home bar build. So in case you couldn't tell from the title of this video, I'm going to be going over how I built and installed these frameless cabinets, both base cabinets and upper cabinets. This was a huge project, lots of parts and pieces, lots of planning went into this, but I really love the way it all came together. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with the video.
Before we get started, I just want to mention this video is sponsored by Crazy Glue, and you'll hear more about them a little later in the video. So as with any big cabinetry project, I started by breaking down my plywood. And as you can see, it was a bit of a challenge getting this full sheet up onto the crosscut table, which was honestly one of the main reasons I ended up installing this thing. And I still think making rough cuts with a circular saw or track saw to get the full sheet into more manageable chunks makes things a lot easier. Anyway, when breaking down plywood for a project like this, I make sure to keep track of my factory edges, since making a cut on a full sheet will likely leave you with a slightly skewed cut. Because of this, I always cut the board oversized, then come back and recut that edge using the factory edge again as reference. Then, with the cut edge nice and straight, I rotate the board 180 degrees and trim the piece to final size, cutting off the factory edge. Now this is a lot of work, but it's really important to cut off all the factory edges, as they won't provide a clean edge, whether it's for edge banding or just a good joint. The factory edges are also usually slightly damaged from moving the sheets around. So the one other tip I have when breaking down plywood at the table saw is to set your fence to a measurement once. So for example, I knew all of my base cabinet side panels were 23 3/4 of an inch wide, so I made sure to cut all of the cabinet sides to size while my fence was set to that measurement. And that ensured that even if my fence was off ever so slightly, it wouldn't matter as the sides would still match up. I did the same thing with my stretchers, and if your stretchers aren't exactly the same length, the cabinets will not end up square. Anyway, the pieces you've seen me breaking down here are all for the base cabinets, which I built first, and let's hop into SketchUp to see how these cabinets come together. So this is a pretty basic frameless cabinet construction with 2 sides, a back, a bottom, and a few stretchers to create the top. And everything will be held together with pocket screws and glue, which makes for a really strong and simple to assemble cabinet. And I decided to go with a full back panel on these cabinets, and there were a few reasons for this. First, it makes for a super strong cabinet. Second, it allows for easy assembly, since I can add pocket holes to the back panel, which will be hidden in the final cabinet. And C, if you go with something like a 1/4 inch back panel and 3/4 inch nailers at the top and bottom, you've got a lot more work to do as far as cutting a groove for the back panel and cutting those nailers to size. And you might save a few bucks worth of plywood, but I'd rather just have a super strong cabinet that was easier to put together that will last for years. Back to the build, after getting all of the pieces for the base cabinets cut to final size, I could start edge banding the pieces. And in case you're not familiar, edge banding is a veneer with an adhesive on the back face, which allows you to cover up the plywood edges and make the panels look more like solid wood. There are a few different types of edge banding, including iron-on and peel and stick, and I decided to go with peel and stick edge banding on this project. The process for applying this peel and stick edge banding is really simple, but it helps to have a few tools to make the process go a little bit more quickly. First, I would cut a length of edge banding to rough size and then run it over the edge of my workbench to remove that curl from the edge banding being rolled up. Next, I would peel the backing off and then apply the edge banding, making sure to leave an overhang at both ends and on both faces. Next, I used a pressure roller to apply pressure to the edge banding, which activates the adhesive and creates a super strong bond. Then, using these flush trimmers, I would cut each end flush, making sure to pick up those little offcuts and throw them away so that they don't stick to everything in my shop. After cutting the ends flush, I would roll the surface again, focusing on the edges to make sure they were well adhered. The next step was to cut the faces flush, which is super simple with one of these edge trimmers. And one other thing I would have done if I had known about it would have been to take the trimmer apart. It breaks into 2 halves, so that I was only trimming one face at a time. This would have meant that I could go with the grain on both edges, which would really minimize any chip out. And oak is particularly stringy, and I would sometimes get some tearing when trimming both faces at once, but overall I still ended up with nice edges. With the edges trimmed, the last step was to break the edges, and this edge break tool is another purpose-built product for that, but you could definitely just use a sanding block here. Since I was going to be doing a ton of edge banding on this project, I wanted to be as efficient as possible, so I picked up all of the tools that I could. That's the basic edge banding process, and on the base cabinets, you really only need to edge band the front edges, so things went fairly quickly. Once the edge banding was done, I could start drilling the pocket holes, which, as I mentioned before, I used as the joinery on this project. For the pocket holes to be hidden in the final cabinet, I needed to add them to each end of the stretchers, 3 of the sides of the bottom panel, and the 2 side edges of the back panel, which I think will make a little bit more sense once you see me assemble the cabinet. Also, since I was going to be drilling a few hundred pocket holes on this project, I pulled out my Craig Foreman pocket hole machine, but any pocket hole jig will work here, and as a testament to that, I built that entire bank of cabinets for the miter saw station you see in the background with my Craig K4, which is only about $100, and a job site table saw. With all the pocket holes drilled, I could move on to assembling the base cabinets. And the first step was to attach the back panel to the 2 sides with 1¼ pocket screws and glue. And on this project, I used Crazy Glue's new fast dry wood glue, which I really loved, and I'll talk more about it a little later in the video. After adding the glue, I clamped the pieces in place and then drove in the pocket screws. And I was really careful about making sure everything was properly aligned before driving in the screws, as they tend to move things around, and any misalignment here will cause a lot of issues later on. With the back attached to the sides, I could add the bottom panel, which was again attached with screws and glue. First, I would apply glue and then slide the panel in place with the cabinet sitting on my assembly table. And then I would clamp the bottom in place and then flip the cabinet onto its back so that I could add the pocket screws. And once again, I was careful to make sure the edges were really nicely aligned, and sometimes this meant moving the clamps around as I assembled everything. The cabinet I'm working on here is actually the sink cabinet, and it's a little bit unique in that it has this false drawer. And this is a bit of a tweak on the regular stretchers and basically just provides a place to mount a faux drawer front in front of the sink. I assembled this with glue and brad nails, which will be hidden in the final cabinet, and then attached the assembly to the cabinet using pocket screws. And with that, the first base cabinet was done, and I could just move on to assembling the other 2 base cabinets. And these were exactly the same, except they just had one standard stretcher at the front and back of the cabinet, rather than that false front assembly like the sink cabinet. With the base cabinets assembled, next I could break down the boards for the upper cabinets, and let's hop back into SketchUp real quick to see how these come together. So the back and sides are the same as the base cabinets, but the uppers have a full top, as you'll be able to see it in the finished cabinets. Also, both the top and bottom panels are inset 2.5 inches, which will give me room to install under cabinet lighting without it being visible in the finished cabinets. I added a 2.5 inch strip to fill in this gap, which I could cut to length at the miter saw. With all the boards cut to final size, I could edge band the front edges of the boards, which I was really getting the hang of at this point. So before I assembled the upper cabinets, I needed to route in a few grooves for these shelf standards, which I'll use to mount the glass shelving in these upper cabinets. I wanted to inset the shelf standards about 2 inches from each edge and route a groove deep enough so that they'll be flush with the surface of the plywood. I installed this 1/2 inch straight bit from Infinity Tools. I marked a start and stop line on the router table fence so that the groove would end below and above the top and bottom panels, and then I cut a test piece just to make sure my measurements were all correct. As you can see, the process of routing the grooves was pretty simple. I just started with the end of the panel lined up with my mark, lowered the panel onto the bit, and then ran the board along the fence until the other end hit the other mark. After that, I would turn the panel 180 degrees and repeat the process. I could then repeat the same process on the rest of the sides, and then I adjusted the fence to widen the groove to fit the shelf standards, which are about 5/8 of an inch wide. With the grooves routed, I could move on to drilling the pocket holes. With all of the pocket holes drilled, I could move on to assembling the upper cabinets. And again, I used Crazy Glue and pocket screws, and this time I decided to clamp both faces in place and drive in the screws. And this worked really well, and I could also use this parallel clamp to align each area of the panels before driving in the screws. And this plywood was slightly warped since I got caught in a rainstorm coming home from picking it up, so I really needed to use the clamps to help keep things aligned. Next, I could install the top and bottom panels. I used the offcuts from the filler strips as spacers below the panel, clamped it in place, and then laid the cabinet on its back to drive in the screws. And once again, this panel was ever so slightly bowed, so I clamped the spacer in the center to make sure it was properly aligned, and then drove in the screws. To install the filler strip, I added glue to the top edge, clamped it in place, and then aligned all of the edges before driving in the screws. And with that, the first upper cabinet was done, and the other 2 were exactly the same, so I assembled them off camera, and then I could move on to building the drawers. And since I use these Bloom undermount slides on these drawers, which are pretty tricky to install, I figured I'd do a separate video on the drawers, both to keep this video from getting any longer, which it's already pretty long, and to have that video as a separate resource for people building DIY cabinet drawers with those Bloom slides. So that video will be out next week, and when it's live, I'll link to it in the cards here. After installing the one drawer on the other base cabinet, I could add this extra stretcher, which will just provide a stop for the door on this cabinet. Next, I could get to work cutting all the drawer fronts and doors to size, and once again, I made sure to trim off all the factory edges and also maintain grain continuity where I could, and I would have been more concerned with keeping a continuous grain pattern here, but I sprayed all of these pieces with black tinted polyurethane, so it really won't matter much in the finished cabinets. After cutting the pieces to size, I had a ton of edge banding ahead of me. See, I needed to edge band all four sides of all of the drawer fronts and doors, which is a lot of edges. So while I'm edge banding, let's talk about the sponsor of this week's video, Crazy Glue, and their new Fast Dry Wood Glue. So Fast Dry Wood Glue allows you to bond wood in minutes instead of hours, making it the perfect choice for quick assembly and minor repairs. This also means you likely won't even need to clamp your parts, as you can just hold the pieces together for a few seconds until the glue starts to cure, which really makes Fast Dry Wood Glue the perfect choice for assembling quick jigs or reattaching a broken off piece of a board, or as you can see from my project, it's also great for assembling drawers and cabinets super quickly. Crazy Glue Fast Dry Wood Glue is available now at Walmart and on Amazon, and I'll have links in the video description below in case you want to learn more. And thanks to Crazy Glue for sponsoring this video, and let's get back to the project. With all the drawer fronts and doors edge banded, I could move on to getting them mounted. I started with the bank of cabinets, mounting the bottommost drawer front first, and I used some playing cards to space the drawer front off the bottom of the cabinet about 1/16 of an inch, clamped the drawer front in place, then pre-drilled a few holes and drove in some 1-inch screws from inside the drawer box. Next, I just continued working my way up the drawer box, but I accidentally continued to space the drawer fronts 1/16 of an inch apart when I really wanted an 1/8 inch spacing. Because of this, I had to go back and drill out the holes and swap over to some screws with larger heads, which gave me more room for adjustment, which actually came in handy later on. To attach the uppermost drawer front, since I couldn't get a clamp there, I used double-sided tape to hold the drawer front in place while I added the screws. I repeated the same process on the second base cabinet, using the doors and an 1/8 inch spacer to get the correct placement, and once again removed the drawer to add screws from inside the drawer box. Next, I can move on to installing the doors. I used Bloom soft close hinges here and used another set of jigs to help install the hinges. And in case you haven't picked up on it, jigs are an integral part of cabinet making, and whether you make them yourself or use commercially available jigs, they make the process much more efficient and reduce the amount of measuring you'll have to do. Anyway, this jig clamps onto the door, also setting the offset from the edge of the door, and then you can use the included Forstner bit and guide to drill your hole. And the nice thing about this jig is it allows you to drill these holes to perfect depth and perfectly square without needing a drill press. After drilling the hole for the hinge cup, I also pre-drilled the holes for the screws using a 1/16 of an inch drill bit. To install the hinge, I just made sure the hinge was square and then drove in the screws into the pre-drilled holes. I repeated the same process on the other doors, and then I could install the other half of the hinges inside the cabinets. To do this, I just held the door in place and marked a line on each side where the hinge met the inside face of the cabinet. I then used yet another jig, this one from Rockler, to drill the holes, and this jig has a center line, which I just centered between the two lines I marked, and it also has a stop that references off of the front edge of the cabinet, giving you the correct offset for the mounting plate. I clamped the jig in place, pre-drilled the holes using a self-centering drill bit, and then installed the hinge plate. After installing both plates, I could just clip the hinges in place and the door was pretty much ready to go with some very minor tweaking. I repeated the process on the other door and then adjusted the hinges until I got a nice even reveal, and once again, jigs made this whole process way easier where I've definitely struggled with this process in the past. So the last cabinet to work on was that sink cabinet, which has the faux drawer front, which we talked about earlier. And I first installed the door using the same method as we just went over, and then I installed the faux drawer front by adding a spacer, clamping it in place, and driving in screws from inside the cabinet. The last thing to do on the doors and drawers was to install the pull hardware, and I needed to cut a small recess on the top edges of the pieces to allow this edge pull I went with to sit flush with the top of the pieces. To do this, I set my blade height to the same height as the edge pull, and then added a spacer block to my table saw fence to create a hard stop at each end of the recess. Next, I could make a pass, establishing one end of the recess, then flip the board around 180 degrees and make a second pass. And this would ensure the pulls were perfectly centered, and these were for the drawers. To clear out the material in the middle of the recess, I tried a technique that was new to me, sliding the board back and forth across the saw blade using my miter gauge as support. And this leaves you with a perfectly flat cut, but can also be a little bit sketchy, so don't try this if you're not comfortable with this technique. I was barely removing any material, so it was pretty easy, but I don't think I'd try this with much of a higher cut. I'd just swap over to a dado stack. Anyway, I repeated the process on the rest of the pieces, resetting my stop on the doors so that the pulls would be flush on the edges of the doors rather than centered, and then I could add the pulls. As you can see, the pulls sit perfectly flush with the top edge of the fronts, and I just pre-drilled the holes with a self-centering bit and drove in the included screws. The last thing to install on the base cabinets were some leveling feet, which just made installing and leveling the base cabinets much easier. To install the feet, I first needed to drill a through hole through the bottom of the cabinets, and I used a Forstner bit for this and made sure to clamp a block on the other side just to help reduce any blowout. Next, I set the top of the leveling foot into the hole and then pre-drilled holes to attach the foot to the cabinet. And I made sure the foot was square to the cabinet and used a self-centering bit to make this process a little bit easier. The adjustable feet press fit into the base, and then you can turn the bottom of the foot to adjust the height. And the through hole allows you to use a screwdriver from inside the cabinet to make adjustments as well. I repeated the process for the other 3 feet and then installed the feet on the other cabinets. Next, I could cut the toe kicks as well as the filler strips to size, which were the last pieces I needed to cut. So the toe kick boards clip onto the leveling feet with these clips, which are located in a groove that needed to be cut on the backs of the toe kicks. I set my blade height on the table saw and snuck up on the fit, and this groove needs to be a pretty tight fit to hold the toe kick in place. The left 2 cabinets needed an L-shaped toe kick to wrap around that corner, and I attached these pieces with pocket screws. To attach the toe kick to the legs, I roughly placed the clips in the groove on the back of the toe kick, lining them up with the feet, and then slid the toe kick into place. And the clips have some side-to-side play, which made aligning the clips really easy. And I had purposely left the toe kicks oversized, so once they were installed, I marked where I needed to cut this left toe kick and then cut it to length over the miter saw, and I still left the right toe kick oversized until I installed the cabinets so that I could cut it to length based on the fit with the wall. The last pieces to assemble were these filler strips, which just fill in the area between the right sides of the upper and lower cabinets and the wall. And these fillers will allow me to open and close the doors on the cabinets without them running into that sidewall. And since these are fairly wide at about 6 inches, I made the fillers into a right angle piece just to give me more surface area to screw the filler strip to the cabinets. I connected the 2 pieces with glue and pocket screws, and then I clamped the filler strip in place on the right side of the base cabinet. I pre-drilled and added a few screws at the top and bottom of the strip, as well as in the middle, and again I left this filler oversized so I could trim it to width when I installed the cabinets. I repeated the same process on the filler strip on the upper cabinets, clamping the strip so it was flush with the cabinets and screwing it in place. And this filler needed to be flushed up ever so slightly, which I did with my block plane. Next, I could just continue working on getting the rest of the hardware installed on the upper cabinets, which included the shelf standards and some lighting. To install the shelf standards, I first needed to cut them to length, which I did at the portaband, but a hacksaw would work just as well. And rather than using nails to attach the shelf standards, I decided to use these tiny little brass screws. I made sure to pre-drill the holes and switch to the fragile screw setting on my impact driver to drive in the screws. Next, I could clip on the brackets and then set the glass shelf in place. I had these shelves cut to spec at a local glass shop, and they recommended 3/8 inch thick tempered glass with a polished edge, so that's what I went with. And luckily the shelves fit perfectly. Also, I noticed when I was adding the brackets that a bit of the edge banding had lifted slightly, and to fix this, I just added a dab of crazy glue, wiped away the excess, and held it in place for about 30 seconds. Next, I needed to drill the holes for the recessed lighting in the top of the upper cabinets. And I needed to drill 3-inch holes for these lights, and I drilled the holes with a hole saw. I also picked up this new hole saw for this, and it has this really cool feature of ejecting the cutoff without needing to pry it out, and it's pretty sweet. I'll have a link to the hole saw in the video description below in case you're interested. After drilling the hole, I cleaned up the rough edges, which will be covered by the light anyway, and then repeated the process for the rest of the holes. Next, I set all 3 upper cabinets upside down on my workbench, which is one of the flattest surfaces in my shop, and then clamped them together so the faces were flush. I then pre-drilled holes to connect the cabinets, and this will still allow me some room for tweaking when I go to install the cabinets, but the holes will at least be black to match the rest of the cabinets. While I had the cabinets clamped together, I could go ahead and drill holes for the power cables for the under cabinet lighting to run through the underside of the cabinets. I used a Forstner bit for this and drilled the holes towards the back of the cabinets so they would be hidden in the final piece. I also went ahead and pre-installed the lighting, which was much easier with the cabinets upside down, and I just centered the lights and added a few screws. And with that, I had done pretty much everything I could do in my shop, so next it was time for everyone's favorite task, finish prep. So the oak plywood I used on this project is made by Columbia Forest Products and is part of their Touchwood collection. And this plywood is really interesting as it has an enhanced grain pattern, which I think gives the plywood a really striking look. And I'll have links to the Touchwood panels in the video description below in case you're interested. Anyway, Columbia recommends not sanding the touchwood as much as you can get away with, as it'll just reduce that enhanced grain effect. So I just hand sanded the faces of the pieces with 180 grit sandpaper and also broke the edges. This was really all I needed to get a smooth surface, and I was going to be spraying all these pieces black anyway, so it didn't really matter if a few of my pencil marks were left on the pieces. Once all the sanding was done, I got all of the pieces set up for finishing and then got to spraying. And I'm using General Finishes Enduro Black Poly here, and I must say it sprays like a dream. You can definitely roll it on, but since I had a ridiculous amount of surface area to finish, I went with the spray option. I applied 3 coats in total, knocking down the finish with 320 grit between coats, and I also just sealed the cabinet backs and sides that wouldn't be seen in the final install with 1 coat so that I didn't waste time and finish. Once the finish dried, I reassembled as much as I could at the shop, getting the drawers and doors adjusted, and then I loaded up and headed back to the house for the install. So I actually had some work to do in the space before installing the cabinets. I needed to add 2 outlets, one above the future countertop and one above the future upper cabinets, and I also added a GFCI to the outlet near the floor, which is before the other 2 outlets in the circuit, just to meet code requirements since I will be installing a sink here. Once the outlets were installed, I could get to work installing the upper cabinets. I first set up a line laser at the height I wanted the bottom of the upper cabinets. After setting the laser to a height of 54 inches, which would set the upper cabinets 18 inches above the countertop, I mounted a cleat, which was just a strip of 3/4 inch plywood, to the wall at that height. And this cleat will allow me to set the cabinets in place and free up one hand to drive screws through the back of the cabinets into the studs. And speaking of the studs, next I measured where my stud locations were on the wall, transferred those marks to the backs of the cabinets, and pre-drilled holes in the cabinets at those locations. And these cabinets absolutely have to be mounted to studs, as they'll be holding a ton of weight. And I added screw holes at the top of each cabinet to start and partially drove in screws into the holes. Next, I could lift the leftmost cabinet in place and attach it to the wall with some 3-inch cabinet screws. And I attached it loosely at first to allow me to shim the cabinet to get it plumb. And this first cabinet really dictates the rest of them, as the front edges of the cabinets need to line up, so I really took my time making sure everything was nice and plumb. After double checking everything, I screwed the cabinet tight to the wall and then added more screws along the bottom edge of the cabinet. Cool. And finally, I cut away the excess shims. With the left cabinet in place, I could repeat the process for the next cabinet in the line. And again, I pre-drilled holes for the screws to attach the cabinet to the wall, set it in place, and then loosely attached it to the wall. And this time I also clamped the front edges of the cabinets together so that they were flush and attached them to each other using 1¼ inch screws. I then shimmed the back edge of the cabinet as needed and then tightened it to the wall. And I repeated the same process for the third cabinet, and then I could add the filler strip. First, I measured along the right side of the rightmost cabinet, checking to see if the distance to the wall changed at all, and luckily my wall was pretty much dead straight, so I could just rip the filler strip to width of the table saw, but you might have to scribe your filler strip to your wall if it's not flat. Before making the cut, I added some painter's tape along where I would be cutting to reduce tear out, and added another strip to help keep the finish from getting scratched up. After making the cut, I could clamp the filler strip in place and attach it using the holes I pre-drilled at the shop. And with that, the upper cabinets were installed. Next, I could work on installing the base cabinets, and again I set up my line laser, this time at 34.5 inches, and my countertop will be 1.5 inches thick, which will bring the countertop height to 36 inches, which is standard. I moved the leftmost base cabinet into place and realized the baseboards were going to just barely interfere with the cabinets, so I needed to remove them along that wall. To do this, I scored the caulk line at the top of the baseboard and then used this trim puller tool to pry away the baseboard. And this tool is super handy for this task and makes it way simpler. Once the baseboard was removed, I could set the first base cabinet in place and get it level and plumb. And the cabinet levelers I installed made this extremely easy with no shimming required. And I used the laser as reference for the back edge of the cabinet and just kept checking for level front to back to make sure the cabinet was plumb. After getting the cabinet leveled, I added 2 cabinet screws through the back of the cabinet into the studs, and then I could install the sink cabinet. And this was just more of the same process, but I also attached the cabinets to each other, again using 1¼ inch screws, in addition to attaching the cabinet to the wall. The third cabinet had a space to the left of it for the built-in mini fridge, so I first marked where the left edge of the cabinet needed to be, and then I got it leveled. And after getting the third cabinet leveled, I clamped the 2 stretchers between the cabinets, and I first attached the back stretcher to the wall since it will also be supporting the back edge of the countertop, and then attached it to the cabinets using pocket screws. And I repeated the same process for the front stretcher, which I also finished to match the cabinets. Next, I could slide the fridge in place, and it was thankfully a perfect fit. And this New Air mini fridge is designed to be built into cabinetry like this and is front vented. So just make sure you get a similar fridge if you're planning on building it into a bank of cabinets like this. Next, I installed the filler strip for the base cabinets, which was the same process as the upper cabinet filler strip, and it's really amazing how much of a finished look these strips give the cabinets. The last pieces to work on were the toe kicks, and I wanted to scribe this right toe kick to the baseboard and use this scribing tool to mark a line on the right edge of the toe kick. I also added painter's tape to the edge, both to make my mark easier to see and also to reduce hair out when I cut to my line. Speaking of which, next I could cut the toe kick with my jigsaw, and I also undercut it slightly, adding a bevel to the back edge of the toe kick, and this just provides some clearance and makes it easier to fit. After cutting the edge, I confirmed the fit and then marked and cut the other end to final length off camera, and then I could install the toe kick. And again, like you saw me do in the shop, I just added those clips to the groove I cut earlier and then clipped the toe kick in place. The left toe kick needed to be trimmed down slightly since my floor slopes from left to right, and I just ripped about 1/8 of an inch off at the table saw. After cutting it to width, I installed the clips and then clipped the toe kick in place. And with that, I could reinstall the doors and drawers and make any final adjustments. And of course, the cats, my wife, and my little dude had to come check out my work, and I think they were all pretty impressed. The final touches included getting the lighting installed, which unfortunately I'm still waiting on the LED bulbs for, so we'll have to wait to get the final shot with the lights for the video where I'll do the upper doors. And all that was left to do after that was to get my collection organized in the new cabinets.
All right, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. I am loving how this home bar is coming together. Again, next week's video is going to be on building those drawers with the Bloom undermount slides. That was a little bit tricky, took me a while to figure out, definitely some miscut parts there. After that, I'm gonna be showing you how I'm going to build the glass inset doors for the upper cabinets. And then the last video in this series is going to be on building a butcher block countertop out of ash to kind of wrap the whole thing up. If you're not already subscribed, go ahead and get subscribed and ring that notification bell so you don't miss any of my future videos. Also, as always, I'll have links in the video description below to all the tools and materials I used. And last, I have added that YouTube membership functionality. I've actually just added a bunch of different levels to that. So if you want to support me and actually get SketchUp plans for this bar build, go ahead and check that out as well. I'll have links to that somewhere on the screen. All right, thanks for watching, everybody. And until next week, happy building.